This topic is something that is near and dear to my heart, and to be in conversation with Rabbi Meni Even-Israel is really, for me, an incredible, incredible privilege. Translation, when you think of it, is usually not an exciting topic at all. It's usually trying to find one word that can replace another word. So you might say the word shalom, and you say, how do you translate that? And you'll say, it means hello, or goodbye, or peace. And you just need to figure out the right word. But as I hope we'll explore, I believe that in the entire edifice of Torah itself, if you were to ask me what is the act of studying Torah, it is an act of translation. It is an act of taking a text that has an inherent meaning and translating it, so to speak, not just to another language, but to an experience. Every word aligns with an experience. When you hear the word rabbi or teacher or friend or parent or child, each of these words conjure up something for each of us in a different way. And what I want to explore is the art of translation and how the Jewish experience really looks at translation itself. And I wanted to begin because Rav Meni Even-Israel, can I call you Rav Meni? Is that?
Meni is just fine.
Is that okay?
Absolutely great.
Because I really do feel like I'm sitting with a friend, even though we've met in person for the first time today. But I wanted to begin with a very basic question. You know, your father and what you continue in your work has been an art of translation. You have translated the Talmud. You have a Chumash, a Torah. You are working on translations of the Rambam. I want to begin with a very basic question, and that is, what do you think is the most difficult word to translate?
Thank you. Single-handedly, the most complex word to translate is God. God definitely has the most complexity around it. If you're dealing with a regular basic translation, it is God, and then there's the deity, and then you have Lord, and you have Almighty, and then you have, then of course you get the problem, people who write G-D, and you have all kind of other.
Let's not forget the Hashem.
Hashem is very important.
Hashem.
Right. My father used to say that we didn't know we are giving so much homage for the Hashemite kingdom. It's very interesting because it seems that our relationship with God was much more closer, right? We have the famous story about Ruth, right? When we discussing the story there, when she becoming basically the mother of kings, but she's dating or semi-dating this guy Boaz, who was King David's grandfather, and the way they introduce each other is saying Baruch Hashem, as you see, by using God's name. That was the proper introduction. I think we were closer, we felt more.
Where we would use, meaning that's a passage of Talmud, where the Talmud says that in the time of Ruth, they started using the name of God, Shalom, in order to greet one another.
Right. But also they're actually using Baruch Hashem.
Yeah.
Like, bless Yud Kei Vav Kei. That was the opening thing. So definitely the hardest thing, and especially when you deal with, we discussed it before, when you have a complex text, everybody goes to some kind of esoteric text of, Isaiah or Ezekiel, about the angels. Actually, the most complex text we have is our credo, is our line of Shema Yisrael, is definitely the most complex text to translate. The text meaning is, right, you're supposed to talk about the unity of God. This is the one sentence in the text who doesn't talk about the unity of God. It talks about three different gods.
Let's think it through. There's the phrase Shema Yisrael, which is normally translated as Hear, O Israel. Oh, there always that O.
The O there, yeah.
Hear, O Israel. Don't forget the O. Hear, O Israel. I'm going to use Hashem, but it's a four-letter name of God, right, which is so interesting, and I'd like to get to this a little bit. We don't even pronounce that name.
Right.
So, Hear, O Israel, Hashem Elokeinu, the Lord your God, Hashem Echad.
Right.
It's like a very, it's interesting just to point out, it's a haiku. few people pointed that out to me.
Yes.
Shema Yisrael, that first sentence is a haiku. If you do the claps,
Yeah.
I forgot how to, my
5-7.
teacher told me you have to, right?
Yeah, 3, 5, 7, 1, yeah.
So why is that so complicated? It's so complicated. I think that second part, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem, your God.
Right.
What's the modifier of Elokeinu doing to the word before it?
Well, supposedly it's supposed to be that our God, the way we perceive God in our world, is supposed to be our God. So even if other people perceive it differently, our God is the real God, and He's only one with the world around it. The problem is that if I translate simply, which people did, is listen, O Israel, just for you. God is our God. God is one. It's really repetitive. There's a meaning here. Every word the Torah uses specifically have, as we know, 70 meanings. So it was really, really complex to describe it and to decide how to translate it each and every time. And sometimes, if you don't translate properly, you get to a completely different context. You get to something you don't want to know. So in the early Kabbalistic text, there's actually a discussion between the Mekubalim and Christianity about this verse. Our credo, talking about one God, they used against us to show there are three gods.
Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad.
Right, so three.
It mentions God 3 times.
Right, in one sentence, we're supposed to talk about the unity of God. The line should be read, actually, listen, O Israel, God is one. That's one, simple, clear. But that's not translation, that's editing problem. That was not me.
But editing is a part of translation.
Right.
And what I want to point out to the audience is it's so fascinating that the most elusive name of God, the one that we don't even pronounce, is never conjugated in the possessive. Meaning, we have this notion of your God, our God, their God. That only modifies the word Elokim.
Right.
And what's so fascinating about that word, just look at that word, Elokim, if you were to translate that literally, and you got an intro to Hebrew class, I would translate the word Elokim as God's plural.
Right.
Because the suffix at that im, like if you have a word, banim, children, the yud mem at the end usually makes it plural. So we have a name of God that is inherently plural, and that is the name of God that we modify with possessives. Elokeinu, Elokechem. I'm not pronouncing the name properly. I'm substituting a hey for a kuf, just for our audience. But I'm so curious, why is it, do you think, that we have a name of God that is so elusive? You can't even translate it. How do you translate the tetragrammaton in your books?
Usually it's God, simply is God.
G-O-D.
G-O-D, absolutely. It's easier, it's less complex. But sometimes, especially we go to the prophets and Psalms, then it's become a more complex, because sometimes G-O-D actually mean Elokeinu. It's actually, that is the meaning. And especially, again, when you go throughout history and you start implementing more mystical text, even Midrashim, all of a sudden, even if it's the same reading, it might have a different, as it goes down or goes up, depends on the setting of the psalm or the poet or the poetry, you change it. For example, when you say in Shabbos morning, Hodu LaHashem Ki Tov, you have 26 Hodu LaHashem, it's part of Tehillim Kuf Yud Chet. So you say Hodu LaHashem Ki Tov, we have 26 of them, and actually they are the gematria of God's name. So each time you're saying God is actually going down in a correspondence to God's name. So it's really a fascinating thing, but most people, when they read God's name, they just go through it. You know, they're saying God, and they don't pay the attention to it. It's a part of the trial of looking on the name of God is that you really have to spend time talking about God. I mean, this is a translation aside. Part of the issue is that we don't discuss what God is. And
this is something that has beguiled me, and I'm almost worried to talk about it, and that is...
We're among friends.
We are among friends. I'm always nervous. There might be a double agent in the crowd. But what makes me so nervous about the following statement is that the Jewish people have such an emphasis to avoid idolatry and to avoid any graven images or any depiction of God. There's something inherently that a Jew knows, that image of God with a white beard, sticking out his hand to try to touch Adam, we know that's not God. But on the flip side, it's very hard to think about something that cannot be expressed or cannot be depicted. I know there is one philosopher who said something that really scrambled my brain in a way, where he said, in a sense, the only way to avoid idolatry is to be an atheist. Meaning, I don't want to freak anybody out, and I'm not advocating for atheism, so please don't leave until he answers this question. But if we're not supposed to attribute any image to God, and I believe, somebody one time asked me, we were talking about Mashiach and the Messiah.
We're going from God to Mashiach, really downhill here.
Careful. Easy does it. But when somebody said, what do you think about? And I said, well, what do you think about when you think of God? I said, I think people think about, honestly, people think about either, I don't know, if they have good feelings, they think about a parent that they like. They might hear the voice of a teacher, of a Rebbe, of a scholar. What, honestly, are you supposed to think about when you think about God? If you're not supposed to give any depiction of this image, you're not supposed to think about an old man in the sky. We know that. You're not supposed to attribute God as being a great cathedral or sculpture. So what are you supposed to think about? What are those words supposed to conjure up for you? What is the purpose of those words? And I would almost add to it, when we have words that we don't even pronounce. So what on earth are you supposed to be thinking about? What is the image that the word God is supposed to cultivate inside of us?
Wow, we have only 46 minutes left. The key word I think that people need to use, and I think that is the way I grew up, is fanatheism. It's not fanatism. It's the idea that God and the world are one. Okay? Pantheism. It's P-A-N-N-T-I, whatever.
Different than pantheism.
Yes. This one is that God is completely part of the universe, and the universe teaching us about God, and God teaching about the universe. They're interchangeable all the time. There's nothing around that is not God. So when you wake up in the morning, before we start imagining God is, or what God isn't, everything is God. I wake up in the morning and my first good feeling, I hope I have a good feeling when I wake up in the morning, is thank you, God. That's the reason that we are trained to do this. But it's really meant to be that your conscience is that from the moment you're waking up till the moment you go to sleep, you're surrounding yourself with God, and everything you see is godly. And in that level, everything it is. It's not just a matter of what we call kedusha, of holiness. It's not only when I putting tefillin on, learning. Everything I do, I see, I feel is God. It doesn't mean that is pure God in the sense of it cannot be away from God, but in a sense, this is everything godly. So therefore, when you start thinking about it in a deep level, so you start appreciating if it's nature, if it's even human beings. And I grew up like this my father used to wake me up to synagogue once a week, Shabbos morning. It doesn't matter, it was snowing in Jerusalem, it was raining in Jerusalem, once a week, Shabbos morning, we went all to the old city, to his synagogue, and he insists on that. That's the only thing he insists religiously with us. Seriously, all his life, that's the only thing he cared about. We used to walk up, but when we walked together,
just to walk with
him to the old city. And it's about 45 minutes walk when he was young. When he was older, it took an hour and a half. And first of all, we knew the people we met. It depends what time we woke up in the morning. So, they became like clocks. Oh, we are late. We met him before the bridge, after the bridge. In the way to the old city, we used to live in a German colony. So you walk what's called the path of hell, Gei Ben Hinnom, which really was traditionally was the gates of hell. That would come from. My father used to stop every time and joke that is one of the movie theaters there, it's called the Cinematheque, has 2 palm trees around it. Actually, there's 4, but there's 2 palm trees. And the Talmud says that the gates of hell have 2 palm trees. Just so you know. But it used to stop in every flower and every plant and every... I can even tell you the difference of each rock on the walls of Jerusalem. I can tell you which one is first temple, second temple, when in second temple. He really tried to appreciate it. Not historically. That was not the point. The point was to appreciate everything around you. When I grew up later and I realized that is really his method of teaching, that both the holy and this what we call secular or the unholy are still part of God. So if again, as benign as taking a shower and as deep as learning mysticism, it's all godly. And when you have it in your mind, all of a sudden you and God become closer. But you have to pay attention to it. If you don't pay attention to it, and you're going to avoid using God's name, which we're supposed to, then you limit yourself to creating a distance. Our relationship with God is supposed to be, in a sense, one. That's what we're saying. Listen, Israel, your God, God is one. Our existence directly depends on our relationship with the Almighty.
There's something very interesting, and that is that in the creation story that we have, as opposed to, earlier creation stories, if somebody were to ask you, what imagery do you think of? What imagery do you conjure up when you think of creation? So some people might think of that, the Sistine, the hand. Some people might think of, like a scientist at work. What's very interesting in the Torah is that the act of creation is described as an act of language, of speaking, where God, instead of the verb that is used in the Torah, instead of a verb of, doing things, the opening verb is vayomer, an act of speaking, where one can actually consider that the world itself is an act of translation, where, so to speak, anytime you read something in translation, there is an original experience, there is an original word, there is an original intent, and you are trying to transmit it to somebody who is unable to access that original act, that original experience. So the world itself, so to speak, can be an act of translation. And what I wanted to know specifically is, what do you think are the qualities that made your father such an incredible translator?
So the most important quality he had, that he actually spoke the language, starting in Hebrew, perfectly. He actually had a good education. He spoke Hebrew in a really professional level. 2, he always kept his secular education. He grew up non-religious, and he became religious when he was, again, depends who you ask and when you ask him, 14, 15, 16, 17. It depends who you ask, and when he was in his mood. And throughout his life, he explained religious text using secular examples, secular language, which make the text much more accessible. When we applied the same thing to English, we insisted that the people who are going to work for us, they're going to have at least master's degree in English language. Judaic studies, it's easier to do. It's really the English ability. That's one thing he had in a very good way. The other thing he had, which I think a lot of people lacking, he didn't think that extra words or making the text more elaborate make it more understandable. He actually believed the other way around. He said, if I cannot say it in 10 words, I can't say it in 100. Obviously, certain things you don't have a choice. You have to use 100 words. But in general, he always cut down the text. After he had the stroke in 2016, he had to finish the work on the Mishnah, right? So this is a man who cannot speak, right? He had the stroke, can't speak. The only thing he can do is, he cannot add more text to the notes that he received. He can only deduct. So he went through something like 26,000 pages, A4, of corrections.
After his stroke.
After his stroke. Yeah, this is after the stroke. I mean, I wish I would do it, have the ability to do this before. And he basically only subtract text. We have thousands of those pages still kept that he basically erasing. And that was the main thing for him. He knew how to make a perfect idea in a very small amount of words that be comprehensible and you can understand, saying, that's what he meant. The perfect example for that is his book on mysticism, The 13 Petal Rose. 13 Petal Rose is my father, best book. Unbelievable book about Kabbalah and mysticism. And again, it's a very small book. It's about 180 pages. It's very, very small. And if you read it from A to Z, you get the message. You understand what's going on. Of course, you can elaborate it for thousands more pages, but the core, the ideas, the notion are covered in a very short space.
Being a great translator is much more than being bilingual. Being a great translator, any true translation, you need to be bicultural. You need to understand the world of the reader of the language that you are coming in. And I am curious, for you and your father, outside of Torah, were there specific writers or artists or ideas that helped inspire and contribute to the gift of translation? I have no question whatsoever in my mind that the fact that your father was brought up secular contributed to his ability to be such a masterful translator, because he understood the world where we don't take these concepts for granted. Very often when you grow up in a world, you start taking all the language for granted. There's a famous story that's told over by David Foster Wallace at his presentation, at his commencement address at Kenyon State College, where he tells this story of two fish that are swimming together, and one fish turns to the other fish and says, how's the water today? And the other fish looks at him and says, what the heck is water? Meaning, when you're surrounded by something and you're brought up in something, you take it for granted in such an obvious way, you don't even have the language to transmit it. So I'm curious, for you and your father, what were the cultural windows that informed this gift of language and translation?
So first of all, my father had a traditional, what we call classical education. He actually learned Latin. That's one. I didn't know it till much later. He learned Arabic. This is all in school. Before what he on himself learned Persian, Greek, etc. One of the people who had major influence on him, which is funny, it happened to be later on when he married my mother, became a family. It's Isaac Asimov. Isaac Asimov, the science fiction author, is my third cousin.
Is that true?
Yeah, my claim to fame, that's it. Forget about my father, it's Isaac Asimov. Yeah.
I happen to love that. There is something about science fiction which to me is a translation of certain mystical ideas and experiences.
The other thing my father did, which again was I think it helped his translation, it was his ability to make the association, but not only with two similar texts. Because of his brain, the way his brain worked, he can really combine 10, 12, 15, 18, all in his head, by the way, not in writing, of different commentators and different translators that he learned already by passing, and he combined them together. He had eidetic memory, literally remember everything he read. And what I saw when I got his job, when he actually asked me to come work for him, so I asked him, so what's the big deal? Listen, you have a translation of Talmud. In Hebrew, there's 16 different editions of it, 16. So what's the big deal? He said, the big deal is that what we do is we take all the gamut of commentators and we make one straight line, and our goal is the people who learn it, for the students, for the audience, to have the easiest way around. We don't care if sometimes it's conflicting, as long as the readability is a max. So once you're putting that, you are sacrificing some of the translation quality, because you're willing to take an example. You're willing to take Rashi here and Tosfot there. You're allowed to take a 2nd century commentator, a 5th century commentator, and a 12th century commentators all together. And you can bring them together. And that's something he did. For me, it's much simpler. I'm very much a technocrat. So I go through the list, I hire the people. There's a very meticulous test. We do a test on Shabbat Daf Kaf Bet. Don't ask me why the head translator decide. And that's what you do a test on. And
So before you hire a translator, you give them a test to see how well they translate.
yeah, I translate and edit, because all translators need to be automatically editors. The way my father's system, original system was, my father will write the translation / commentary on the Talmud, and then his team will edit it, bring it back to him for second edit. He will edit punctuation. And then the editing had to go again because it's completely sometimes changed the entire context of it. Then went back to him after second editing, and then we'll add the extra materials around, the reality, the realia, not reality, the personalities and everything around, and went back to him again for third or fourth time. In English, it's different. In English, the demands are a person can really need to be fluent in the text, and you really need to keep in mind 2 things. One, we want the books to keep a decent size, because we don't duplicate pages, so it's 1 page. There's no extras. And 2 is that really the audience need to be able to read it like they're reading a novel. If the English is not good enough, we're not interested. I don't understand I understand that people sometimes they want to get a deeper understanding of some text because it's very important. Less important for us. More important for us, you read, and then later you do whatever you want with it. As my father said it many, many times, my goal is to create a teacher in your pocket. You become your own teacher.
Were there any texts, and I'm curious why, and I can imagine that your father felt were not translatable, that he said, for whatever reasons, either technical or linguistic, or because he felt it was not appropriate, were there any texts that your father said, we're not doing a translation of this?
Sure. I'll start with a story. So 2009, finally we're finishing the Hebrew Talmud. It took too many years. Too many years, too much money. And again, my father said, okay, now what are we doing? Now what? Normal people, when you finish a master work, you go home and you rest and you're enjoying the fruit of your labor. My father is like, please suggest something to me. I'm like, me? How am I connected to this? So I went home, I did a research of what's available. So I said, listen, I came the next few days, I said, we have 6 available projects. Tanakh, Bible, Mishnah, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, Zohar, and Midrash. 6 major projects. My father looked at me and said, okay, first of all, we're taking off Zohar. I said, but you told me, this is another story in the story, that every Jew needs to learn only 4 books.
What are those 4 books?
Oh, very nice. Good you ask. It's very small. Tanakh, Bible, Talmud, Shulchan Aruch, and Zohar. Small books.
4 lists.
Yeah, by the way, I told my father that I'm not comfortable with this list. Said, I'm not reading Shulchan Aruch. Anyway, when I ask a rabbi a question, they don't know the answer, so it doesn't matter what I'm reading, so I'm going to read Rambam instead. It's much more clearer, much more obvious, and it's much easier to translate, clearly.
Sure.
And instead of Zohar, which I read by myself, I'm going to read Derech Mitzvotecha.
Beautiful.
With the Tzemach Tzedek commentary, because
Sure.
It's pure Kabbalah. It gives you everything you need. If you want to read more in your free time, read Zohar. My father agreed. But that's the 4 books I'm saying. I said, why not Zohar? He said, it's not canonized. The text is not canonized. And I looked at him and I said, okay, so this is like this is a hornet nest.
What do you think he meant by that? That the text is not canonized. What a fascinating response. I would not have guessed that. What do you think he meant by that?
I think literally he meant that the text we have has too many versions of it. We don't know where they come from. We don't know. Some texts have language issues. When you read the Zohar, again, I recommend it's a fascinating book, but you need to have a lot of patience when you read it. Some of the texts, you see the Aramaic is over 500 years of Aramaic. I mean, you need to be, if you speak Aramaic to any decent level, you see the gap. It's a 500 years gap there, easy. Again, if you ask Gershon Shalom, it's only started in the 14th century, but we're not going there. Just be nice. So that's what I think he meant. Also, he said the problem is we don't know where to start. Other books are easier to know where they start. Like Bereshit, we know it started Bereshit, even though the assumption of the author, God in this case, is that everybody accepts he's a God. Because in the beginning, there was God. Obviously, you accept the fact that he's a God. Something about Sefer Yetzirah, which is the core book of Kabbalah, you assume you believe him that he has 10 sfirot and 22 letters. He doesn't give you introduction to that. So that's in general, but that's with Zohar. And the second thing he didn't want to do is Midrash.
Why did he not want to do Midrash?
Because he already did it.
Explain.
So in 1957, 8, 9, my father was a freelance by Rav Kook Publishing House, and they did the Midrash Gadol, which is the Yemenite Midrash, and my father did a commentary on Vayikra. He just did, and he said, I'm not doing this again. And then he did exactly what he did. He did the entire Tanakh. He gave 929 classes, some of them already available online. We published the Bible from it. He did the Mishnah, he did the Rambam, and then he did a dozen other books here and there, but
I want to ask you the following question. We often ask this in sports or in other areas that are not quite as holy as translating Torah. Who is on your Mount Rushmore? Let's give you one for your father. Who do you think is the Mount Rushmore of translators of Jewish ideas?
Wow. The first one, I think, is Moses.
Why is Moshe a translator?
Because Moses, as we know, he received a message from God. He's the only one that actually see God compared to the other prophet. And his interpretation is much more closer to the source than anybody else. And Moses has to make something that is unbelievable. Moshe has to teach the people about the heritage when they don't have a heritage. Talking people who are slaves, and he has to tell them the stories about the forefathers, which he was not growing up with it either. So he's really the first translators. And we really see it in this book. In the book of what we're reading now in the Torah, the Deuteronomy, Dvarim, it's a translation, because we see he takes things out and takes things in, and he adding things that we never saw before. The differences of different Ten Commandments, the difference of the way he describe the spies, all kind of things. That's I think the first one. I think definitely the second one will be Judah the Prince.
Yehuda
Hanasi, because what he did in the Mishnah is, again, it's not traditional translation, but he took a tremendous amount of information and he made it to a codex. He made it to information that was understandable by all. One of the problems about lore and legends and story and heritage is that the way I tell a story and the way you might tell a story, even though we were both present in the same situation, will be a completely different experience. So when Yehuda Hanasi write this, he has to take, again, thousands of years and put them together as one.
I love thinking of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's project of the Mishnah as a project of translation. I actually shared this somewhat recently, that if you just take the first Mishnah, the first opening Mishnah in Brachos, which is the first Mishnah in the entire project of the codification of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, you could get a glimmer that he was really translating a redemptive experience, a world that had a Beis Hamikdash, a world that had prophecy, a world where God's presence was palatable and obvious and apprehensible, and translating that experience and that world into an exilic world. What would it mean? What would it mean to find God in a world where his obvious presence is seemingly absent? And you see it in the first Mishnah.
Right.
He does it expressly. There is one word in the first Mishnah, in fact, and I'll mention this just because I wrote a book on it, can I plug my book also?
Sure.
We're just I'm going
Is
to plug
Koren
my
selling
book as
his
well.
book? Koren is not selling his book. No, you can't plug it.
I'm not selling it here, but I am plugging it. But the word that appears in the first Mishnah in Brachos, which is absolutely fascinating, does anybody know what words that... It seems like an unnecessary new word that the rabbis came up with, as if we didn't have 100 great words for it already. That is the word Aveira. Aveira is the word used for sin. We have a lot of great words for sin. We have the Bible's got like a whole bunch of them. Chet, Avon, Pesha, all these great words. But it's interesting, in that first Mishnah, you could see the project right there.
You can see the same idea, actually, in the book you do hold, which Koren does sell, which is our first Mishnah, Pirkei Avot, available in your local store, is that, and up behind you, is that even the first Mishnah, when he does the transmission of the law, he makes decision how the law is. He skips generations. Some generation he talks about, some generation he doesn't talk about, and he talk about the biggest mystery of Jewish history is Anshe Knesset Agdola, the members of the Great Assembly. Nobody in the right mind know what the members of the Great Assembly, who they are, how many of they are, when they started, when they ended. It was really, really not clear, and he brings it up in that particular moment.
We have two more left on your Mount Rushmore, and then we're going to do a couple rapid-fire questions.
Sure. The third one will be the Rambam.
Rambam as translator, taking kind of the whole edifice of the entire Talmud that was developed in Babylonia and translating it into
modern law in his time.
Modern law, beautiful.
Right, and I think the fourth one, and again, this is the Lubavitch plug, is the Alter Rebbe. The Alter Rebbe Tanya is a little translation.
What is it a translation of? What is Tanya a translation of? First
of all, it's a translation of his forefather, the Maharal Miprag text. I mean, clearly he was deeply based on the Maharal Miprag books. The way he thinks, the way he talks is like that. Two, he is the first one to translate modern Greek philosophy in his time to become modern Jewish philosophy of his time. He created a book that was not created for 1,000 years before, since the Rambam, so it's 700 years. Create a book that can be reinterpreted every generation. I hear more people interpret the Tanya today as a psychology book. I'm sure the Alter Rebbe did not think about it, he didn't thought about it. It was not about wellness, it was not about feeling good. The Alter Rebbe was very clear what's the purpose of his book, but his translation, his ability to bring probably every single mystical tradition to one position, I will call it translation.
This has been absolutely eye-opening and fascinating. And honestly, I could talk about language all day. I could talk about translation all day. If you put a gun to my head, I could talk about font size all day. I love fonts, talk about different fonts. And your father, I know, paid quite a bit of attention to the aesthetics of the page itself. But we're winding down, and I know for myself, I am not a translator in the typical sense, though I think anything that I have ever written is a translation of sorts. One of the projects that I consider the most obvious translation that I do is I write a thematic essay at the end of every tractate of Talmud along with Daf Yomi. So I take a tractate, whether it's tractate Brachos or tractate Yevamos, as esoteric as it might be, as irrelevant as it may seem, and I try to write what is the central theme of this. And for me, writing these essays is my number one joy in life. I love learning Talmud and then asking myself, what is the central theme over here? How do I translate something at, Eruvin, Yevamos, Levirate marriage? How do I translate this to a contemporary audience? I'm curious for you, Do you have a favorite translation? Do you have a favorite idea that has been rendered into another language, an experience, an idea, a text? Do you have a favorite translation?
Of my father or in general?
In general, your father could do both.
I thought about it. Probably my most favorite text is right now, especially since October 7th, is chapter 44 in Tehillim. Chapter 44 in Tehillim, in the best of translation, is the only chapter that I can find that basically tells God to wake up. Back to where we started with conversation, being close to God. The sons of Korach, that famous Korach and his descendants, they write a very powerful conversation about the fact that the nation is in troubles and suffering a great defeat. And they're asking one question: where are you? They're not asking what we did wrong. They have a whole list of that. But the main story is the where is God? Ura lama tishan havaya. Why don't you wake up, O God? I think that's one of my favorite these days. But before those dark days, my favorite is Tractate Tamid. It's short and sweet, and the only stories, they have great stories there. They have one story about Alexander the Great, Alexander Macedon, and his meeting with the Amazons. I think it's a fabulous, fabulous story mentioned there. And then there's the end of it, which it's always fascinating, is a story about the temple. What actually was happening and what's the hope for the future. So that was really my favorite text.
Speaking of the future, my final question is, what is on your vision? What is on your bucket list? What do you hope? What translation do you think the world needs most right now? This has been an incredibly harrowing year since October 7th. We still have so many Jews, too many Jews, in captivity. We have people who are suffering, who are in pain. But there's also a coming together in a way where people are thinking for the first time in their lives, what does it mean that I'm Jewish? What is this identity of mine? And I'm curious for you, do you feel that there's something that has yet to be translated that can speak to the contemporary world, to this moment, to right now? Where would you go in the library of Jewish texts and tradition that has yet to be translated that you would like to bring to a contemporary audience?
If it was up to me and I had the ability and the leverage to do so, I think I will make a definitive list of what every Jew has to know. What is the basic, what make you pass the test, so to speak? What is the bare minimum that you have to go through? You know, if you go around the world and asking, how many hours do you have to teach Judaism in your system? So you have the systems in Israel, you have 16, 18 hours a week. You have systems in Europe, you have 1 hour a week. Now, then the second question is, what is Judaism? In Israel, Judaism is very clear. You have Jewish text, that's one. Everything else is connected to the right subject. If it's Hebrew, it's not Jewish. You're learning Hebrew in school because that's the language. Learning Jewish history, it's not Jewish, it's history. You're learning Holocaust studies, it's not Holocaust, it's part of history. When you go overseas, you go around here, we're called diaspora, all of a sudden, all those things are part of Judaism. When the teacher in Italy, the biggest school in Rome, 1,000 kids, has 5 hours a week to teach Judaism. And they have to teach also, I forgot to mention that, they have to teach in culture, prayer. You have all these things. I would love to create the ultimate book of what is the bare minimum, the core, the heart, the steel. This is what you have to do, and everything above that is an upgrade.
This has been such a privilege and pleasure speaking with you today.
Thank you, sir.
The Rohr Jewish Learning Institute has the largest collection of Jewish media online. Hit subscribe for more.